Okay, well, hopefully I don't need any introduction, having spoken to you for the last 10 weeks. What I'm going to do is just taking sort of the points that Hillary's made and just bring them back to a sort of, some specific examples of from a UK perspective. And I think when we're looking at these sustainable development goals, I think it's quite easy for many managers and businesses to think that these lofty ideals and these goals don't apply to them. As I said in my intro, it's easy to lose that global context. It's easy to think local and become insular. But these goals potentially touch every aspect of any business, and they should be considered as if, if we're going to build back in that sustainable, greener way, then we need to be looking at these goals at every decision point. I'm very fortunate to work for the Duchy of Cornwall, which does reflect how we attain our strategic objectives. They get reported in our annual report. I'd love to show you the latest one, but it actually gets presented to Parliament next week, so it's not in the public domain yet. What I'm going to do is go through each of these just very briefly in turn, giving the UK context and perhaps one or two Duchy examples. And hopefully what we will see is that sort of synergy and crossover between those objectives that Hilary mentioned earlier. I do want this session to be interactive. So what I'm proposing is that for each of these goals, as they pop up on the screen, in the Q&A, I'd like you to just pop the number of the goal. So for example, goal 8, good jobs, just put number 8. And then I'd like everybody to just, put their thoughts as to how the UK land management sector can deliver against that goal. So we'll do it as we come to each one, but hopefully at the end of this, we'll build up quite a nice picture of how this collective audience think that we can deliver. So let's go straight into them. So the first one, no poverty. The rural land sort of landscape, is often thought of as a rural idyll by those people that don't live there. But what it can do is mask pockets of very real poverty. One of the most striking ones is fuel poverty. Not everybody has the luxury of mains gas. In some cases, there are no alternatives to oil because they may lack poor power infrastructure, for example. But there are other barriers to coming out of poverty. Poor transport links can hold people back. And as we know, broadband and connectivity is vital. The picture there is for it's actually taken up in Cumbria. It's the Barn project where they've connected communities in what is a pretty wild landscape, but it's been transformational in terms of people's learning and giving people access to knowledge. No hunger. I'd like to say that in 2020 that no one in the UK goes hungry, but sadly that is not true. We've seen food banks being used at record levels. The picture on the top right for me is the striking one. We all saw that in March. I don't think we ever conceived that we would see empty shelves in the UK. I think it highlighted the fact that we've got a very fragile food supply network, and that in promoting sustainable agriculture, we need to also look at resilience in terms of food supply. We need to think about the impacts of climate as well, particularly when we look back at the last 2 months, incredibly dry. It's pouring with rain today, but it's been incredibly dry, and we need to think about that resilience to climate change. We also need to think in a local context as well. There's some talk now about going back to local abattoirs just to sort of shorten those supply chains, which is quite important. The other picture up there is of the Kew Millennium Seed Bank, and that diversity of plants as well is incredibly important as we protect ourselves moving forwards, to make sure we don't lose heritage varieties, but we keep that diversity of species. So don't forget, as we go along in the Q&A, if you've got thoughts as to how the land management sector can contribute, please pop them in there. Good health. Again, land management sector has an opportunity to work as almost the natural health service. We saw through COVID how people were desperate to go outside, get into open spaces, and the difficulties of managing that. National parks, beaches, we all saw it on the news. But that growth in outdoor education and outdoor recreation is really important, and equally important is how we manage it and also how we fund it. The picture there is actually of our green space that we provided as part of our scheme at Nansledden in Newquay, and that saw extraordinary use during lockdown as people discovered it as an open space and went and enjoyed it, which was fantastic. The other aspect of health is, of course, mental health, and particularly in the rural sector, in agriculture particularly, it's quite an isolated industry, and the importance of mental health should not be ignored. And there's some great charities doing some great work out there, helping people in real need. The quality of education is also vital for our sector. There's a thirst for knowledge. We've seen that in our Slido answers. It starts with the schools and the colleges. We've had an education roundtable as part of this series, and next week I'm involved in a pilot where we're delivering some virtual work experience for land management professionals, talking to sixth formers about the industry and what we do on a daily basis, just to try and attract more people in. But that learning should continue through life. You see there a group of Dorset farmers on one of their farm walks. Seeing is believing, and you've got to keep learning, to keep adapting, and we're in this process of change, and it's so important that you know, we keep on learning. It's just so important. On the subject of gender equality, it's said that no country can truly develop if it leaves half its population behind. Of our 180,000 farmers in the UK, about 17% are female. And I suspect that's a feature of the industry and kind of historical, just the way things were done. I'm pleased to say that, you know, the Duchy, we gradually got one or two females as sole tenants. We've also got a large number of joint tenancies at the Duchy. The top picture is Emily Suavo, who's a tenant on our Newton Park estate. She's got 300 acres, specialist cropping, including quinoa and a 6-acre vineyard. Bottom left, we've got Sam and Emily Stables up in Herefordshire. And on the right-hand side, we've got Kevin and Justina Hughes, who are joint tenants up in Herefordshire as well. And I think outside of the industry, the land management sector is getting a lot better, and we're definitely seeing a great improvement in terms of gender equality, particularly in professional services as one sector. Water and the sustainable management of it is paramount. On a wet Thursday, it's easy to think that the rain will never stop, but just look at the last 2 months, as I said. We have to look after it, and you know, managing those catchment areas is absolutely key. Tim and I spoke earlier this week to the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership, and they were telling us about their catchment management declaration that they've been doing with water companies and land managers in water catchment areas. And it's so important. It's also vital that we think ahead. You know, today's slurry landing on the ground, the nitrates can take up to 60 years to filter through to the aquifers. And, you know, you sort of look back as to how things were done even 20 years ago, and you think there's a problem coming down the road. But we have to look after our water. Renewable energy, we have a huge part to play, the sector. We have the space to grow biomass crops. We've got opportunities for solar on the ground and on the roofs. This is our home farm at Highgrove with solar panels on the roof of the cubicle shed. There's also opportunities for wind power, but what we have to do is think about the environmental impact of those alternative energies. And we also have to think about, you know, food security, particularly in the context of bioenergy crops. It's really vital that we think all sort of eventualities through. We also have to think about long and hard about environmental performance of our built environment and EPCs particularly. And we will see that continually be tightened by the government and hopefully a support network to enable property owners to continually improve their standard of insulation, etc. Turning to jobs and economic growth, that's probably the most challenging thing that is facing the UK right now, post-COVID. I believe there is an opportunity for a rural renaissance. Perhaps it's an opportunity once and for all to redefine the economy in the rural area, and perhaps, you know, bury once and for all the sort of illusion that we all weave baskets in the countryside. Actually, people want to work in beautiful spaces. I think the days of big offices are potentially going to look very, very different. And I think people may want to work more locally and more creatively, perhaps. This building here is one that I was involved in my previous role up in Cheshire. And the tenant came to the estate originally wanting to be in a much sort of more modern location, but we persuaded him he wanted to be in the rural area, and it was a fantastic creative space. Talking about innovation and infrastructure with the land management hat on, it's easy to get sort of focused on aspects such as agri-tech and precision cropping, which definitely has its part to play in delivering sustainable food, and also reducing our reliance on artificial fertilizers. But we also need to think about our infrastructure and how we make that resilient. I mentioned earlier about the importance of digital connectivity. 5G is coming at us down the road, but we can't rely solely on that form of technology. We need to think about other means. Point-to-point wireless and hardwired internet are so important. And again, that's one of those topics that crosses over a number of these goals. Talking about inequalities, there are many social injustices in the UK, and rural deprivation is right up there. You'll see from the map on the screen that some of our most beautiful areas of the country are also the highest on the deprivation index. They lack access to basic services, they lack access to social care, healthcare, and they lack access to transport, and in some cases easy to reach education. And that's something that the land management sector, it's a difficult nut to crack, but nonetheless, in every decision, we need to be thinking about how we can improve opportunities for all. Sustainable cities and communities, that's been a key area of focus for the Duchy. Back in 1988, His Royal Highness did a programme called A Vision of Britain, where he talked about the good and the bad of architecture and design. But he also talked about the sense of place and the importance of community in the built environment. And continuing our sort of seeing as believing theme, within the Duchy, we've delivered most of the Poundbury development, and we're now working on Mansledden, where sustainability has really been at the heart of those schemes, and the communities have been at the heart of those schemes. We've created jobs and employment. We've ensured that people can walk and permeate through the developments. There isn't a reliance on cars, and good design has been at the heart of everything we've done. But that applies also to smaller developments of 2 or 3 houses. Good design has to be at the heart, and we need to consider things like affordable housing and making sure it's sufficient and suitable in the right places as well. Responsible consumption, again, we need to be more responsible in how we do things. The land management sector can do more. I'm still horrified by the amount of plastic that is used in food packaging. I think there's been a rather worrying rush back to plastic during COVID. It seemed to be the default position for everybody to make things safe. But we need to think about local food networks, shop local, buy local, eat local. This picture here is of the Newton Farm shop, where, as you can see, there's an opportunity to minimise waste because you can pick your own veg. And, I think things like that, we need to just build that into our DNA in terms of how we make decisions. In terms of the climate, as we've heard a number of times throughout the webinar series, the answer lies in the soil. We've got some massive opportunities in the land management sector to solve problems. If you do look at the order of magnitude, whilst emissions from agriculture are significant, it also holds the key. And how we manage land is absolutely crucial. And perhaps above any other industry, the land management sector is uniquely placed because it can sort its own house out, and it can also help sort other people's houses out in terms of offsetting carbon from other industries. We had an interesting presentation the other day from a national firm of agents, and they talked about an 8% reduction in emissions that's taken place since the onset of COVID. But in order to deliver our objectives, we need to achieve that every year. And what we can't do is crash the economy for 3 months every year. So we really have to think laterally about how we're going to deliver those zero carbon objectives. It's not always an obvious link between the land and the sea, but if you look at soil runoff, I mean, last autumn there were some aerial shots. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to share them on this presentation, but there were some aerial shots showing soil runoff in the Severn estuary during the floods, and the whole estuary from satellite was brown. That's not a good place to be. The picture in the screen here isn't some idyllic Greek island. It is actually our most western tip of the Duchy. It's the Isles of Scilly. And for a long time, we've been negotiating with South West Water, and they're going to adopt the sewerage and water provision to the islands, which will be a massive benefit not only to the islanders, but also to the marine habitat as well. Talking about life on land, we have to protect our biodiversity. And we all, as land managers, have that joint responsibility, not just to our neighbours and to our fellow sort of citizens on this island, but we have to remember that a great number of different species of wildlife migrate here for limited periods of time throughout the year. So we almost have a responsibility to look after those species on behalf of our neighbours as well. Important feature is that it's not just about standing still. The damage has been done to habitats, the damage has been done to wildlife, and we have that responsibility and obligation to help repair that damage and build back better. Peace and justice, again, it's an interesting one to think about. How does that relate back to land management? And I think the take I'm going to have is that I'm going to talk about accountable institutions, and as the Duchy, we are accountable. We do integrated reporting, and here's last year's report. And as I said earlier, we report on our KPIs, we report on our strategic objectives, but crucially, we also have reference to what our impacts are as an organisation. And I think that's a really good discipline, no matter what scale of business you're operating in the sector. In my last role, I began to report internally in a very similar way, because I think it's good to just take that slightly wider look and just judge your impact on others. And finally, goal 17, the partnerships for the goals. And really, for me, that's why we're here. Everybody that's participated in this series, the conversations that are taking place on the Slack channel, those are the partnerships that are going to make this happen. And the collective and collaborative rural brain, I believe, can make a real difference. That's it from me. Thank you.